In the 1980s and 90s, Timothy Walter Burton, aka Tim Burton, was hard at work pioneering a gothic fantasy style that would eventually come to define some of his more popular films. The twisted, almost amorphous structures and overly lanky character configurations were dead giveaways. If you saw a trailer like this, you knew it was Tim Burton in the driver's seat. Now, I tell you that story to tell you this story. 2021's Lost in Random is like if Tim Burton, in his prime, made a video game with a team of developers who were totally on board with his vision, and it ended up turning out pretty well.
Attention, Wanners! I am the Queen, and my dark dice will decide your fate. Random rules!
Lost in Random follows the sisters Odd and Even, the latter of which we'll be taking control of over the course of the adventure, which is amazing because everyone who talks to you ends up sounding like Snagglepuss.
We'd better keep our voices down, Even.
Go now, leave Even.
You see, Random refers to the realm in which this story takes place. It's composed of 6 separate cities denoted by the 6 sides of a dice. Ruled over by an evil queen, the entirety of the kingdom operates on this notion that random rules.
For random is fair, random prevails, and random rules. Random rules!
Once children come of age, they're forced to roll a mystical dice that determines which of the 6 layers they'll be stationed on. And sure enough, Odd's roll puts her in the care of the queen herself, the incredibly sought-after 6th layer. It isn't long before Even is spurred on to rescue her sister from the queen's influence, obtaining a sentient dice that can be used in conjunction with magical cards to fight off the evil monarch's machinations. Now, there are a few games where the environment sort of becomes a character unto itself, and Lost in Random is an excellent example of this. A kingdom that has become so warped and twisted by random chance is so unbelievably interesting. Two Town, for example, is filled with residents harboring split personalities, where the queen's daily role dictates which one becomes more dominant. It's all incredibly weird, wonderfully creative, and, in my opinion, probably the game's strongest selling point, aside from its incredibly unique combat system.
Was the Queen's Royal Robot Guards. She had to think fast. She had to roll the dice.
At the beginning of each encounter, you'll be forced to knock off chunks of ore from your opponents that translate into dice energy, allowing up to 5 cards to be drawn from your deck of 15 once collected. At the press of a button, throwing dicey freezes your enemies, and assigns you a number based on your roll. You can then use this number to purchase cards in your hand, their costs denoted by a number in the upper left. These can range from swords to bows and arrows to the ability to do damage by blink dodging through an enemy. Outside of combat, you'll get the opportunity to find and purchase more cards to add to your deck, allowing you to foster a host of strategies to suit your playstyle. But in the end, each encounter is, quite literally, a roll of the dice, forcing you to adapt to your hand as well as your roll. This makes battles pretty exciting, if not a bit samey by the end, because the fact of the matter is, despite having to switch for a few more powerful variants here and there, a broad focus on melee, ranged, and healing cards will get you through most encounters. Truth be told, while I had a few close calls, I never went down once to a single enemy or boss fight with this approach. Nevertheless, it's fun to experiment, and there were a few combinations that I really enjoyed getting in one hand, allowing me to use all 5 cards in a single go. Now, the actual fighting is fairly basic. Melee weapons allow for light combos or charged attacks, and aiming your slingshot or bow, on the other hand, always felt a bit stiff. But a generous lock onto your enemy's dice energy crystals helps alleviate some of the frustration. A simple dodge mechanic takes a bit of getting used to regarding its timing, but like the rest of Even's moveset, it's serviceable to say the least. That said, while I think the overall combat leads to some fun and complex scenarios, having to harvest the aforementioned dice energy in order to do, well, anything in combat always felt a bit weird. Like there's this big build-up to an encounter and then you're spending the first few seconds of it running away and firing at your adversaries with a crappy slingshot. It just creates this odd pacing to each fight that I was never a huge fan of. But to be fair, these feelings didn't start popping up until I was approaching the absolute end of the game. I'd say during the vast majority of Lost in Random, like 90 to 95% of it, I was absolutely enjoying almost every aspect of its combat. So take all of the aforementioned criticism with a grain of salt. What's here really is pretty fantastic, barring a few board game sections that have you pushing a piece across a linear course with your dice rolls. Not too much to talk about here, but the concept of each of these sections always felt a bit undercooked. And one in particular was, I'm just gonna be honest, hell on earth. It was probably one of the first times the game's emphasis on random chance collapsed in on itself like a neutron star.
Nothing that years of therapy won't fix.
Okay, no, this part right here, unless you have this card in your deck, absolutely sucks. Therapy cannot fix this.
I know. It stinks.
Combat is an undeniable highlight of Lost in Random, but I venture to say that its world building and how it's sometimes able to guide you through that world deserves special mention as well. Overall quest design is incredibly creative, and the wildly inventive towns and their many secrets will definitely have you wondering what's around each corner. In many respects, it's this sense of curiosity that will push you through each area, but the pacing of it all definitely has some issues, especially when it's keeping you in one of those towns for just a bit too long. Needless to say, it wasn't a game that I was necessarily itching to play when I got home from work. The developers also had an apparent affinity toward these sort of esoteric, dreamlike sequences. They're used a bit too frequently for my liking. The world's already weird enough, so stuff like this felt a bit unnecessary for how often they pop up.
All right, who's not dead? Sound off.
That said, pacing can also come in the form of player progression, and you'll find a fair amount of small doors and plenty of containers holding a hefty amount of coins to purchase new cards from arguably the best character in the game, Manny Dex.
The greatest cards in the land, from my body to your hands.
Purchasing enough cards allows you to open a pack, adding new cards to the store's inventory. It's a nice gameplay loop that managed to stay pretty interesting throughout, even though my deck didn't really change all that much from beginning to end.
Who could possibly dwell on the past when we've got cards in the present?
Things are funky in the hood even.
Regarding the overall presentation, I'd say Lost in Random's style definitely deserves a nod. Now, having played a very early version of the game, I was expecting a few glitches. I'll give it this much, there was only one that actively forced me to reload a prior save. Other than that, you've got some missing sound effects here and there. But then there are the weird ones. Exiting out to the main menu even, disappears and the game just glitches out for a second, like it's being held together by duct tape. They're pretty hard to ignore. The soundtrack is also pretty hard to ignore for the opposite reasons. The orchestral score is moody and incredibly appropriate to each setting. I'd also say that most of the voice actors do a pretty good job of playing off of the overdramatic world in which they find themselves in, save for one late game character who mispronounces the word uncharacteristically.
Time is short, so I will be uncharacteristically direct.
Don't know why, that just really bugged me. The problem lies instead with the writing and the way in which Lost in Random's dialogue is delivered.
Maybe this time I should listen.
Now, I'll say that the dialogue itself is actually really good, and with even in particular, a wide range of emotions are demonstrated through just a few lines of dialogue. The problem is, there's just too much of it. Nearly every character seems keen on giving you their entire life story, and it can grind the pacing down to a crawl. Now, to be fair, a lot of it is entirely skippable, but in a world this crazy, I was sort of eager to hear about its history from the point of view of those living in it, which was a big mistake on my part, apparently, because people often have way too much to say, their dialogue regularly not even lining up with the subtitles.
Well, anyway, I should get back to inspecting this pipe here.
In regards to how that dialogue is delivered, Lost in Random opts for that flappy jaw animation as opposed to lip syncing.
You see, I've noticed that you have a dice with you.
Now, for me, this isn't too much of an issue, but the lack of character movement, and more importantly, camera changes during any one given conversation, made me understand why I wasn't given the option to turn off the subtitles. It's because if I did, I would just be staring at a screen where Even would be staring at me for like 20 seconds. The lack of movement and animation within conversations made them even more obnoxious to listen to when coupled with the overabundance of dialogue. Again, all of these things are completely skippable, and I strongly recommend you do so. To be completely honest, I would have too. Except when I'm recording footage, I try to see everything the game has to offer, and unfortunately, that included every voiced line I came across. And that really sucked when I was talking to Dicey, who speaks in strange chirps and utterances that Even has to sort of interpret or translate back to the player. Every single one of these conversations, despite giving us insight into Dicey's background and point of view on particular situations, was absolute torture, and I sort of wish they were omitted from the game entirely.
What the hell are you talking about?
I'm going to do something I call the compliment sandwich, where I say something good, then talk about where you need improvement, and then end with something good.
The combat is incredibly unique, making fights bombastic and fun during the vast majority of the game's runtime.
Where you need improvement.
But it's pretty easy to exploit, and you won't need to switch up your strategy that much once you get the hang of things.
Something good, something good.
Its presentation is in stark contrast to pretty much any other game on the market, emphasizing a gothic look reminiscent of some of Tim Burton's most iconic films.
Where you need improvement.
But its visual glitches are incredibly hard to ignore, and while its music successfully captures the atmosphere those environments portray, not everything meshes together perfectly.
Something good, something good.
The story is pretty fantastic, with loads of memorable characters and districts plucked straight from some of your most imaginative dreamscapes.
Where you need improvement.
But the pacing of it all is sometimes a bit off, the game having you spend too much of your time running from place to place or pushing you through an overabundance of dialogue.
Something good, something good.
Luckily, the last something good is what I'd like to call the most important piece, my overall impressions of the game as a whole. And while it's incredibly easy to pick apart Lost in Random, its atmosphere, story, battle system, and visual style carry it through troubled waters more often than not. This is a game that I would wholeheartedly recommend for all of the above reasons. And while it isn't perfect, it's an incredibly unique experience, all its own.
Famous film scenes as performed by cartoon characters.
Rosebud, even.